Emily Warren, an ambitious young journalist, arrives in Black Hollow, a forgotten little town in the United States countryside, almost hidden among the mountains and surrounded by dense pine forests. The city, with its old wooden houses and almost deserted streets, seems to be stuck in time, as if the changes of the world outside had forgotten that place. The sound of the horses' hooves from nearby farms echoes through the valley, while the icy wind carries an unusual silence, broken only by the occasional creaking of trees and rusty gates. Emily is there to investigate the mysterious disappearance of a group of 4 geologists who, according to records, were mapping the area about a month ago. No clues were found as to what happened to them, and local authorities seem to have lost interest in pursuing the investigations. This aroused the curiosity of Emily, always attracted by unusual stories and buried secrets. Upon arrival, Emily feels an immediate discomfort. When she tries to talk with the villagers about the disappearance, she is met with suspicious looks and evasive answers. Some suggest that the geologists went too far and that the mine was dangerous, but most merely murmur that Emily should not stay where she is not called. The owner of the hotel where she stays, Mr. Halpern, a middle-aged man of tired features, does not try to disguise his aversion to the subject and only says that strange things happen here. He closes the blinds of his office at nightfall, as if trying to prevent something from watching him from outside. As the days go by, Emily realizes that Black Hollow is a city where everyone keeps secrets, and those secrets seem to weigh in the air. The whole city lives in an atmosphere of tension, as if the inhabitants know something terrible, but refuse to admit. During her walks through the city, she sees houses with closed windows, doors locked with iron bars, and some streets too deserted for such a small town. Nobody talks about the redwood mine, except vaguely, always with a warning, better stay away from there. On her first night in Black Hollow, Emily stays in a small room at the city hotel. It's a night of new moon, and the darkness outside is almost palpable. The only lights that light up the city are the old poles, whose lamps flicker occasionally, increasing the feeling that something is wrong. Near midnight, while reviewing her notes in bed, Emily begins to hear a strange sound. At first, it is almost imperceptible, something distant, like the sound of wind or running water. But as she pays more attention, the sound becomes clearer, a low echo reverberating through the deserted streets of the city. It is something that seems natural to the first impression, but carries a disturbing quality, almost as if being emitted from somewhere deep below the surface. She approaches the window and looks out, but sees nothing but empty streets and the darkness of the forest surrounding the city. The sound lasts only a few minutes before disappearing, and although it is not enough to alarm her completely, something in her begins to feel observed, as if the city itself was aware of its presence. The next morning, Emily tries to question the few residents with whom she has gotten a little more contact. She mentions the echo she heard the night before, but everyone shuns the subject. The lady who works at the local cafe, the only one who seems slightly more open to talking, just says with a nervous whisper, "Some things we should not hear." And who listens? Well, better not to listen. Determined not to let this mystery slip, Emily makes detailed notes about what she heard and resolves to investigate further on the Redwood Mine, the site that appears to be the center of all the secrets of the city. She discovers, in a quick search of old archives from the local newspaper, that the mine was closed abruptly after a collapse that killed 13 workers. But something in the records does not make sense. The bodies were never found, and the case was closed with a hurry that raises suspicions. When Emily tries to move forward with her investigation, the villagers start getting more hostile. An older woman, sitting on a balcony, sees her from afar and murmurs to herself, "One more stuck will end up like the others." The climate of fear and mistrust seems to grow with each step that Emily takes towards the truth, as if the city itself tries to distance her from something she should not discover. At the end of the first part, Emily feels that she is increasingly isolated, both by the geography of the city and by the behavior of its inhabitants. The city holds a secret that no one wants to reveal, but which every night becomes more evident for her. The mysterious echo continues to sound on new moon nights, and Emily begins to realize that it is not a simple sound. There is something more in that sound, something that seems alive, waiting to be found. After the bewildering silence of the residents, Emily Warren decides that the best way to understand the mystery is to investigate for herself. Your first stop is the Old City Library, a worn-out stone building where the air is thick with the smell of old books. The shelves are full of old volumes, but the section on local history seems to have been neglected. Little material is available, and much of the documents appear to have been deliberately removed or filed somewhere inaccessible. However, after hours of searching, she finds a small file hidden in the back of an old closet with fragmented information about the Redwood Mine. The mine was one of the main sources of income for the city in the 1940s, with dozens of workers living in improvised camps in nearby mountains. Emily learns that the mine was closed abruptly in 1953 after a collapse that caused the death of 13 workers. Local authorities claimed it was a natural accident, but something in between makes her suspect a darker truth. As she delves deeper into her investigation, Emily begins to find scattered mentions in old newspapers of strange events that occurred at the mine before the collapse. Workers had reported feeling presences in the deep tunnels, as if they were being observed. In addition, shortly before the accident, one of the mine supervisors would have started to suffer from delusions and paranoia, claiming to have heard voices coming from the depths of the earth. In the course of further investigation, Emily discovers a letter from one of the miners, written days before the accident, describing something even more disturbing. During one of the deeper excavations, they found something in the rocks. It was not a cave, nor an ordinary mineral vein, but something that seemed alive. The miner spoke about a strange crystal formation in the walls of the cave, something that emitted a very low sound, almost inaudible, but that made the workers feel disoriented, as if the sound was stirring their minds. He described this as the beginning of echoes that would later become haunting for Emily. The few survivors of the accident never publicly spoke about what happened, and the families of the workers killed were strangely quick to accept compensation and close the case. Emily wonders why no one seems to have fought for answers, and why the collapse was so quickly muffled. As Emily advances in her investigation, the city becomes increasingly hostile. The suspicious looks of the locals become frequent. One morning, when she goes for coffee at the local restaurant, she feels the heavy looks on her, as if she is breaking a silent pact. When asked an older woman about the workers killed in the mine, she receives a cold answer: they knew what they were doing. We all know. She realizes that the inhabitants of Black Hollow have a deep-rooted fear, not just of the mine or recent disappearances. The fear is of what the mine hides, something that seems to have a sinister control over the city. The hotel owner, Mr. Halpern, who was previously reluctant to talk, now seems directly nervous about Emily's presence. One night, he knocks on her door and warns her in a dark way, "You must go away, before it's too late." When Emily tries to understand what he is talking about, he silences her with a panicked look. There are things we can't dig up without suffering the consequences. But he offers no further explanation, and his tormented expression only increases the feeling that there is something very wrong. Defying the warnings, Emily decides to go to the Redwood Mine. The road up there is narrow and surrounded by dense trees, which seem to close around you as it approaches. The mine entrance is deserted, blocked by a rusty wire fence and covered with rusted warning signs. She feels a growing restlessness as she approaches the entrance. The surrounding area is strangely silent, as if the sound itself was being absorbed by the earth. As she crosses the fence, she hears again the echo, clearer than before, reverberating from the depths of the mine. It is not the sound of wind or the typical noise of a cave, but something that seems alive, almost like a whispering voice, inarticulate, but full of intention. She feels a bit of panic, but her desire for answers makes her move on. Inside the mine, the tunnels are claustrophobic and dark, with old tools and abandoned cart tracks scattered everywhere. The walls of the galleries are cold to the touch, and the darkness seems to extend infinitely. As she moves forward, Emily has the feeling of being followed, but when she turns, there is nothing. Only the echo, now stronger and closer. Deep in one of the deepest tunnels, she finds something surprising, a hidden camera, which seems to have been deliberately avoided by whoever has explored the mine before. Inside, on the walls, she sees what can only be described as crystalline formations, exactly as described in the old accounts. They emanate a dim light, and it is from this chamber that the echo seems to come. Emily approaches the crystals, fascinated and terrified at the same time. She plays one of the formations, and at the moment when she does, the sound of echo floods her mind. But this time it is not an empty sound. It is as if thousands of old and distressed voices were trying to communicate, a crushing presence that makes her retreat with a cry. As she leaves the chamber, Emily begins to piece things together. The mine is not just a common mining site. Something has been discovered in the depths of the earth, something not human and very old. The town of Black Hollow and its inhabitants have known this for generations, and the mine was closed not because of a simple accident, but to prevent that presence from being discovered and released. The echo she has heard since she arrived in town is not just a sound. It is a call, a manifestation of that which is trapped in the depths, trying to reach those who are willing to listen. And now that Emily heard the call, there is no turning back. The disturbing experience in the mine makes Emily feel vulnerable, as if she has touched something forbidden. Back at the hotel, she tries to process what she saw and heard. Those strange crystals and the harrowing echo still resonate in her mind. Fear begins to blend with the relentless determination to find out the truth. However, the deadly silence of the city continues to oppress her, and she feels that Black Hollow is always eyeing her. During a tense conversation with one of the few people in town willing to interact, an old man named Arthur Greaves, Emily gets an unexpected clue. Arthur is a reclusive man, always sitting on the porch of his house, watching the city with a somber expression. He is reluctant to talk, but ends up mentioning that before the collapse in the mine, his father, Howard Greaves, worked there as a foreman. He never talked about what happened in that mine, except for a few nights when he was tormented by nightmares. He kept a diary, in which he wrote about the weeks before the accident, but Arthur had locked the diary in the basement after his father's death, afraid of what it contained. Reluctantly, Arthur gives Emily the key to the basement and allows her to take the diary, on the condition that she returns it and does not mention to anyone what she has read. Back at the hotel, Emily leafs through Howard Greaves' diary. The first entries are simple reports of a foreman responsible for keeping the men in line and ensuring that operations went smoothly. He describes the mine as a dangerous place, but normal for the standard of the time. However, as she moves through the pages, Emily notices a change in tone. Howard begins to mention strange incidents, unexplained noises coming from unexplored tunnels, low and disconnected voices that seem to resonate on the rock walls, and a persistent feeling of being observed. 2 weeks before the collapse, Howard writes about finding a hidden camera during a deep dig. The miners found strange crystalline formations on the walls of the cave, which pulsed with a faint and whispering light. Initially, the team believed they had discovered a vein of valuable ore, but soon realized that the crystals seemed alive, reacting to the presence of workers, emitting a low vibration and an unmistakable sound, the echo. Howard describes how miners began to behave strangely, becoming disoriented and aggressive. Some have sworn that they heard voices calling them by name, from the heart of the earth. He speaks of nightmares that haunted men, dreams of being pulled down from the earth by invisible hands. What scares Emily the most is the last entry in the diary, written the day before the collapse. Howard mentions that some of the workers, guided by voices only they could hear, began to dig deeper into the walls of the cave, as if being guided by an irresistible force. He writes in trembling letters, "It's not a mine, it's a prison. Something was buried here, and now that we have found it, he wants to get out." Determined to find out more, Emily decides to visit one of the city's oldest residents, the Reverend Amos Caldwell, who lives reclusively in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of Black Hollow. Caldwell is an old man, with shaky hands and hunched eyes that seem to have seen more than anyone should. He rarely receives visitors, but upon hearing the name of Howard Greaves and knowing that Emily was in the mine, agrees to speak. During the conversation, the Reverend reveals that Black Hollow was built on ancient sacred land long before the arrival of the European settlers. The indigenous people who inhabited the region avoided certain areas of the mountains, believing that something evil was buried there, something that was not of this world. They spoke of an ancient spirit, an entity that slept in the depths of the earth, and any attempt to disturb it would bring great disgrace. When the first settlers arrived in the region and began mining the mountains for gold and silver, they ignored the warnings. The Reverend tells that the first founding families of the city knew that the mine was digging into the depths of something that should remain hidden. The secret order that controlled the city, formed by some of the richest and most influential men, decided to keep the mine operation despite the danger signs, because the riches it generated were indispensable. But then came the incidents, the voices, the disappearances, and finally the collapse. But the collapse was not an accident. The Reverend reveals that the mine was deliberately sabotaged by the secret order to seal the chamber that the miners had discovered. They believed that this would prevent the entity from leaving. Yet, instead of containing evil, the sabotage only angered him, and now the echo that reverberates on new moon nights is a reminder that what is buried down there is not dead, just waiting. Emily discovers, horrified, that the secret order still exists, formed by the descendants of the founding families, and that they have maintained a tight control over the secrets of the city. More disturbing still, it begins to piece together. With each generation, Black Hollow is the scene of inexplicable disappearances, as the recent case of geologists, and these events seem to coincide with the nights when the echo becomes stronger. She begins to suspect that these disappearances are not random, but rather sacrifices made by the order to keep the entity asleep. The price of keeping the evil contained is to offer human lives to the ancient force that inhabits the mine. The families of the city know the secret, but they have accepted the covenant to protect their own lives. Nobody talks about it, and anyone who comes too close to the truth is silenced or ends up disappearing. Emily now understands the reason for the disappearance of geologists. They have come too close to the truth, just like her. As Emily processes these revelations, she begins to feel a growing presence around her. The echo that once seemed distant is now constant, whispering in your ears, invading your thoughts. During the night, she has vivid nightmares, dreaming that she is being pulled into the mine, where the crystals shine with a hypnotic light and the voices become clearer, calling her to join them. She wakes up sweating cold, with the feeling that the entity is aware of your presence and wants it. At the end of this part, Emily realizes that her investigation is not just about finding out what happened to the geologists or the dead miners. She is now engaged in the same deadly game, and the force that inhabits Black Hollow is waiting for her to make a move. The Echo has chosen her, and somehow she is part of the events that are about to culminate in something terrible. After her discoveries, Emily feels the weight of what she now knows. The nights became more and more suffocating, the whispers of echo louder, invading your thoughts even during the day. She knows that she can no longer continue in the city without facing imminent danger. However, the need to solve the mystery and save those who may still be in danger keeps her in Black Hollow. As he prepares to leave the hotel, Mr. Halpern, the owner, frantically knocks on his door. He is pale, with a look of despair in his eyes. "They know what you have discovered," he says with a trembling voice. "If you don't leave now, it will be too late." He tells her that the secret order is aware of his investigation and that, on that night, the final ceremony will take place. A sacrifice will be made to calm the entity, and Emily will be the target. But Emily knows she can't just run away. Something deeper draws her into the mine, as if the truth is not yet fully revealed. There is something else going on, and she feels that she needs to go back to the mine to end what she started. When night falls on Black Hollow, the city seems to plunge into a supernatural silence. The air is heavy, as if charged by an invisible energy. Emily feels a presence around her, as if she is being watched by something ancient and powerful. Determined, she makes her way back to the Redwood Mine, now with the knowledge that the city has a pact with this entity that resonates in tunnels and crystals. As she approaches the mine, she notices something different this time. Several hooded figures, members of the secret order, are gathered around the mine entrance. They carry torches, their faces partially hidden, but Emily recognizes some of the citizens who until then seemed so common. Among them is the Reverend Amos Caldwell, who now reveals his true face as one of the leaders of the order. They are in the midst of an ancient ritual, speaking words in a language that Emily can't recognize, and at the center of the circle is something that makes her freeze, a human sacrifice. Tied and kneeling is one of the missing geologists, who Emily believed was already dead. He is in a state of trance, his eyes glazed as if being guided by invisible forces. The Reverend raises a ceremonial knife, ready to complete the sacrifice. Emily realizes that if they complete the ritual, the entity will be strengthened, and the cycle of death and despair will continue forever. With her heart racing, Emily makes an impulsive movement and runs towards the circle, shouting to stop. The hooded ones were surprised by her audacity, but soon they reconstituted themselves, surrounding her. The Reverend, with a somber look, explains that the ritual is necessary. "You don't understand what's at stake," he says, his voice low. "This entity has protected the city for generations. It demands blood, and without it we will all be destroyed." Emily, however, already knows that this is a lie. The entity does not protect Black Hollow. It imprisons her. Fear and superstition have kept the city under their control for decades, perhaps centuries, and now that it has found the answers, they know the only way to save the place is to break the cycle of sacrifice. The hooded begin to advance, but Emily yells at them about what she found in the mine, the crystals, the entity, and the truth about the collapse. She reveals that the entity was being held prisoner, and that the Order had erred in making the covenant. The Reverend falters for a moment, but faith in the ritual still seems to dominate others. Before she can be stopped, Emily runs to the mine entrance. The echo is stronger than ever, pulsing in her mind, trying to break her will. But she knows that it must go all the way. Inside the mine, the darkness is complete, and the echo becomes an almost physical presence, compressing your thoughts. Emily goes down to the chamber where she found the crystals before. This time, the crystals are shining more intensely, their strange shapes pulsating as if they respond to her presence. She approaches, the echo now so loud that it seems to want to consume her mind. But Emily resists, staying focused on the truth that has been revealed. These crystals are not mere formations, they are a physical manifestation of the entity. She realizes that the crystals are directly connected to the entity trapped underground and that destroying them can weaken or even break the entity's control over the city. With renewed strength, Emily picks up a stone and hits the crystals hard. The first blow makes the echo reverberate violently, like a cry of pain. The cave seems to shake, and for a moment, Emily fears that everything will collapse on her. But she keeps beating, breaking the crystals one by one. With each crystal destroyed, the echo decreases until finally there is silence. An absolute and overwhelming silence. Outside the mine, members of the secret order feel the immediate effect. Reverend Amos falls to his knees, his eyes open in shock. The power they have so feared and worshipped for generations is fading away. The sacrifice is interrupted, and the members of the order, confused, begin to disperse, realizing that something has fundamentally changed. When Emily comes out of the mine, the air around it seems lighter. The echo has been silenced, and for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow, she feels that the city is no longer under the influence of that ancient force. The sky begins to clear with the first rays of sun, a vision that seems symbolic, a new beginning for the city. The next day, the city is still in shock with the events of the previous night. Many of the inhabitants cannot explain what happened, but there is a collective sense of relief as if great pressure had been released. Some members of the order leave the city in silence, while others, like the Reverend, seem to age decades in a few hours, dragging themselves with the guilt and emptiness of having served a dark force for so long. Emily knows that the entity has been weakened, perhaps even destroyed, but that Black Hollow carries deep scars, marked by fear and sacrifice. She lets the city know that even if the echo has been silenced, the secrets of Black Hollow will still live in the shadows, waiting for those brave, or fools, enough to investigate. Ethan Parker is a 26-year-old boy, born and raised in a big city in the eastern U.S. He has always been an adventurer, a lover of travel and explorer of remote places. After the sudden death of his parents, he decided to take time for himself, embarking on a road trip through the country, looking for some sense in his life. This trip, besides being a way to escape grief, is his way to rediscover what the world has to offer, away from the urban chaos that he knows so well. Physically, Ethan is tall, with short brown hair, a beard to be shaved, and tired eyes, reflecting sleepless nights and the weight of memories he carries. He is observant and curious by nature, which often puts him in risky situations. Despite his intelligence and wit, he tends to be stubborn, something that prevents him from hearing the warnings he receives. As he drove down a long road surrounded by dense trees and fog-covered hills, Ethan sees a small wooden sign indicating the town of Silver Creek. His original intention was to go straight through, but when he noticed that the gas tank is almost empty, he decided to enter. As he crosses the entrance of the city, a sense of strangeness invades him. Silver Creek seems like one of those cities frozen in time, where past and present mix uncomfortably. Old wooden houses with poorly maintained balconies, a church with a leaning tower, and a central square where only a few people wander in silence. The first impact is silence. Not a natural silence, but one that weighs in the air, almost oppressive, as if the city were holding its breath. The sky is clear, but a feeling that something dark lurks remains. Ethan parks his car in front of an old inn called the Old Creek Inn. The building has a colonial style worn by time, with creaking planks at every step he takes as he approaches the entrance. Inside, he is greeted by an elderly woman, pale skin and deep eyes, who introduces herself as Mrs. Holloway, the owner. She speaks in a low tone, as if she was afraid to be heard. "You're just in time," she says, casting a quick glance at the window. "The sun is starting to set. If you need anything, feel free to ask. And remember, don't stay out at night." Ethan smiles, finding the comment strange, but does not go deeper. He is tired from the trip and just wants to rest. As he climbs the stairs to his room, he notices how the place seems almost deserted except for a few other quiet guests. The room is simple, with an old wooden bed, a window that looks out onto the square, and walls that creak at the slightest movement. A cold breeze passes through the half-open window, and Ethan closes the curtains, trying to ward off growing strangeness. The next day, Ethan decides to explore Silver Creek. The morning sunlight makes the city seem a little more friendly, but still, something seems out of place. He walks to the local cafe, Silver Diner, where some residents are sitting, but all avoid eye contact or long conversations. It's as if they know something that Ethan doesn't, and they don't want to talk about it. He tries to talk with the attendant, a man named Tom, middle-aged and tense-looking. When Ethan mentions Mrs. Holloway about not going out at night, Tom is visibly uncomfortable. He mumbles something about a local tradition and quickly changes the subject, recommending that Ethan visit the lake north of town. Throughout the day, Ethan notices that the residents have a pattern of strange behavior. When the late afternoon approaches, he sees shops closing earlier than usual, and the few people who were in the streets disappear into their homes, closing windows and doors as if a storm was coming. However, the weather is perfect, with no signs of bad weather. During a walk through the most remote streets, Ethan crosses an old man sitting on a bench in front of the square. The man, with gray hair and worn clothes, observes him attentively. "You're from out of town, aren't you?" asks the old man, with a tone that sounds more like a warning than a question. Ethan confirms, and the man says to him, "Go before nightfall, boy. Here is no place for you." Intrigued, Ethan asks what the man means by that, but the old man stops and turns his gaze to the sky, which now begins to color red with the sunset. Despite the warnings and the strange atmosphere, Ethan feels his curiosity increase. Something is deeply wrong in Silver Creek, and he needs to figure it out. However, his stubbornness begins to outweigh common sense. That night, he decides he will not obey the warning to stay inside. He wants to see what happens after the sun goes down. As the night approaches, the tension in the air intensifies. The streets are deserted, the lights of the houses go out, and only the occasional sound of a distant wind is heard. Ethan prepares for what he believes to be only superstitions of a city forgotten in time, but soon will realize that Silver Creek holds secrets much darker than he could have imagined. On the second night, Ethan decides to challenge the silent warning that hovers over Silver Creek. He leaves his room at the Old Creek Inn and walks through empty streets. The silence of the city, which during the day was already oppressive, now becomes suffocating, as if the walls of houses were watching him. The only sound he can hear is the sharp wind swaying trees on the outskirts of the city. As the darkness advances, Ethan feels an uncomfortable presence. It's like something invisible is around him, surrounding him. He looks back several times, but sees nothing. Still, the feeling of being observed grows more and more. In the corners, he notices shadows that seem to move, but whenever he turns to face them, they disappear as if they had never been there. The feeling of being followed follows him through the city, until in an alley he sees a figure. At first, he thinks it is someone from the place, but as he approaches, he realizes that the figure is completely immobile, almost fused to darkness. When Ethan blinks, the figure disappears. His breathing accelerates, and the paranoia begins to settle. Returning hastily to the inn, Ethan finds the front door locked. He hits hard until Mrs. Holloway lets him in with a stern, almost accusatory look. "I warned you," she mutters before retreating to her room, leaving Ethan alone in his growing mystery. Determined to find out what's going on, Ethan begins investigating the history of the city. He begins to notice little strange details in Silver Creek. The locals avoid the city center at night. The square always seems cold even when the sun is shining, and the church bell has not rung since it arrived. Determined to learn more, Ethan befriends a young woman named Grace, a local librarian who, unlike the others, seems less frightened by the mysteries of the city. In the library, Grace shows him an old collection of documents and newspapers from the city. Among the yellow pages, Ethan finds articles and records dating back more than a century. They tell vague stories about disappearances and tragedies that occurred in Silver Creek, always linked to the dusk. All reports mention something that witnesses call the shadow, a being that no one has ever seen clearly, but that always seems to be lurking, invisible, in the shadows of the city. Grace hesitates to talk about it. She mentions that there was a time when the city was growing, flourishing economically, until an unexplainable event destroyed everything. After that night, the city was never the same, she whispers without looking directly at Ethan. Ethan is intrigued by a local legend that tells of a dark pact made by the founders of Silver Creek. Legend has it that in an attempt to protect the city from a catastrophe, they summoned an entity offering something valuable in exchange for safety. Since then, the city is kept under the dominion of this entity, the Shadow, which hunts those who disobey the rules. On the third night, Ethan decides to take his investigation even further. He returns to the alley where he saw the mysterious figure. With a lantern in his hands and a courage that borders on imprudence, he walks slowly through the city. The air is heavy and cold, as if something supernatural was distorting the atmosphere around. As he explores the dark alley, Ethan feels the ground vibrate slightly, as if something is moving beneath the earth. The air around him becomes dense, almost suffocating, and he begins to hear whispers, a cacophony of voices that seem to come from all sides but not from a visible source. Then your flashlight fails. The moment the light goes out, he perceives a high silhouette and informs in front of him. The figure has no face, but his presence is overwhelming. Ethan freezes, feeling a primitive fear take over his body. The figure seems to pulse with a living darkness, and Ethan feels an uncontrollable urge to run, but his feet are stuck on the ground, as if the shadow itself around him is holding him. Suddenly, the flashlight works again, and the figure disappears in the same second. Panting and terrified, Ethan runs back to the inn, his heart beating out of control. With each step, he has the feeling that something is approaching rapidly, as if an invisible shadow was trying to swallow him. When he finally reaches the safety of the room, he locks the door and moves away from the window, his mind spinning in despair. What he saw cannot be rationalized. The next day, Silver Creek looks like a city once again. The sunlight shines through the streets, children run through the square, and residents take care of their routines as if nothing had happened. Ethan, however, feels he is on the verge of collapse. What he saw the night before was not a hallucination. He knows it in his mind. He tries to share his experiences with Grace, but she interrupts him, appearing more cautious than before. "Ethan, you're getting yourself into something very dangerous," she warns, her voice low and urgent. "There are reasons why people here follow the rules. I suggest you do the same." Grace's advice echoes in Ethan's mind as he walks the streets once more. During the day, the shadows seem harmless, but he cannot get rid of the feeling that something is watching each of his movements, waiting patiently for the next twilight. The more Ethan learns about Silver Creek, the more his stubbornness grows. He refuses to run away or ignore what is happening. The city is clearly rooted in something ancient and evil, and he feels he has to find out the truth no matter the cost. Over the days, he continues to observe the shadows, the subtly erratic movements of the locals, and the growing tension that takes hold of Silver Creek as the sun begins to set. He realizes that there is something darker and more terrible at stake, something the locals not only fear, but accept as part of their lives. On the third night, after the disturbing discoveries about Silver Creek, Ethan feels the presence of the entity in a more tangible way. The air at night looks different, heavier, loaded with a pressure that compresses your chest with every breath. As he prepares to leave again, against all survival instincts, Ethan realizes that the city is now completely deserted. There is no one else in the square or on the streets, and all windows are locked and closed. The silence is so dense that even Ethan's own footsteps seem muffled. When walking, the discomfort intensifies. He begins to notice shadows that should not be there. Shadows of people who do not exist, shadows that move even when the light does not change. They slide along the walls of houses and around the light poles as if they were alive. The more he walks, the more the shadows seem to crowd, following him, watching him silently. Ethan tries to keep calm, but the feeling of being watched becomes unbearable. He begins to hear whispers, not from one particular direction, but from all sides, in a language that he cannot understand. The sound is low, almost indistinct, as if the shadows are conspiring with each other. His nerves are at their core. Each corner that folds reveals more darkness, more emptiness, and more shadows that seem to approach slowly, without ever leaving your field of vision. On one of these night walks, Ethan senses a close presence. He turns the corner of an alley and stops abruptly. Before him, the shadow is there, motionless, but now it is more than a distant figure. This time it is lighter, a high and amorphous form, oscillating like dense smoke. His body seems composed of pure darkness, without facial or physical features defined, but its presence is oppressive, almost suffocating. Ethan's fear is so intense that he can barely breathe. He tries to move, but his body refuses to obey. The shadow moves one step forward, and at that moment, Ethan feels a wave of dread run through his spine. The air around him cools, and everything seems to slow down. He finally manages to move and, in a panic rush, runs towards the inn. The streets seem longer, and the path back to the old creek stretches unrealistically. He hears a sound behind him, like a strong wind, but with a strange, supernatural quality, as if the night itself was alive and hunting. When he finally arrives at the inn, he locks himself in his room, panting, his heart pounding against his chest. He throws himself into the bed, but the presence of the shadow does not disappear. From outside the window, he sees a darkness even deeper than ordinary night, and it is waiting. Ethan realizes that now there is no turning back. The shadow has chosen him. The next day, amid growing panic, Ethan decides to confront some residents. He goes to the Silver Diner again, and there finds Tom, the attendant, and two other men who seem to be regular at the cafe. All have the same tired look, of people who have already resigned themselves to an inevitable reality. When Ethan mentions the shadow, Tom abruptly interrupts him. "I warned you not to go out at night," Tom says, his voice firm but not without a hint of compassion. "Now she has seen you, and once she marks you, there is no escape." Confused and angry, Ethan insists on knowing what's going on. The men exchange uncomfortable looks, and finally one of them, Frank, reveals the truth. "She has been here since I was a child. My parents, their parents, they always knew. But you don't talk about it. If you obey, if you follow the rules, she leaves you alone. But if you break the rules, you're hers." The residents made a pact of silence. They dare not face the entity, for they know that the shadow demands a sacrifice, a price to be paid for something terrible that happened in the past, something that the founders of the city did and cursed Silver Creek forever. Ethan realizes that the whole city is aware of the truth, but they prefer to live in silent fear than face evil directly. The revelation fills Ethan with despair. He realizes that he must flee immediately before the shadow becomes even stronger. He picks up his things and runs to the car. With the engine running and the road ahead, he speeds away from the city as fast as possible. However, the more you drive, the more you realize that something is wrong. The road, which should lead out of Silver Creek, seems to bend over itself, and it always ends up coming back to the same point, the entrance to the city. Disoriented and panicked, Ethan tries several routes, but all end the same way. He always returns to the beginning as if the city was folding space around him, trapping him in an endless cycle. With each turn, the presence of the shadow seems to intensify. He feels the weight of darkness growing around him, and the feeling that he is being hunted becomes unbearable. Finally, he stops the car on the roadside, exhausted and defeated. The sky is beginning to close with dark clouds, and the time left until the next encounter with the shadow is running out. He understands that the city will not let him out, or rather, that the shadow will not allow his escape. Back in town, paranoia takes over Ethan. He begins to notice that he can no longer trust his own senses. The shadows at each corner seem denser, more defined, as if they are gaining form and life. At night he doesn't sleep anymore. Every noise, every movement of the wind outside the window makes him jump out of bed. The feeling that the shadow is always present consumes him. He tries to ask for help, but the villagers avoid him. They have become accomplices of his fate, and no one seems willing to interfere. Even Grace, who initially seemed to be his ally, now distances herself from him, looking at him with a mixture of pity and resignation. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she whispers one last time. "But once she marks you, there's nothing else we can do." The feeling of isolation deepens. Ethan is completely alone, with the entity getting closer and closer. He realizes that the shadow is not just a supernatural being, but something much more powerful, a manifestation of the secrets and sins of the city, something that feeds the cycle of fear and silence. Ethan realizes too late that his presence at Silver Creek was not just a coincidence. He has become part of a much older and more terrible story, and the shadow will no longer stop until it consumes him. Ethan's time is running out. Each night that passes, the shadow gets closer, and he knows that the final confrontation is inevitable. Silver Creek, once a small, quiet town, now looks like a living prison, suffocated by secrets that creep in the shadows. The silence of the city during the day became unbearable, and the terror of the nights almost consumes it. On the decisive night, looking out of the window of the inn, Ethan sees that the shadows around the central square are denser, darker. He feels this is the last chance to find out the truth behind the curse that haunts the city. But this time, he won't escape. He decides to confront the entity. With a flashlight in hand and a desperate determination, Ethan walks towards the heart of Silver Creek, the central square where it all seems to have begun. As the night progresses, the shadows move restlessly, as if reacting to its presence. He feels the look of the shadow in every step that takes, like an invisible pressure that pushes him towards the final destination. In the center of the square, Ethan finds an old and worn monument he had never noticed before. It is a cracked stone statue, representing a man of severe expression, one of the founders of the city, he imagines. Upon closer investigation, he sees a partially erased inscription. In exchange for protection, blood will be shed. Suddenly, everything starts to make sense. The disappearances, the secrets, the constant fear of the residents. Silver Creek, long ago, was on the verge of destruction by natural causes, hunger, disease, storms. The founders, desperate, resorted to a dark ritual, invoking an ancient entity in search of protection. This entity, the Shadow, agreed to preserve the city, but the price was terrible. Each generation demanded a human sacrifice. The stories of the disappeared over the years, the bodies never found, were sacrifices to the Shadow, delivered by the residents themselves in a pact of fear and survival. The rules that Ethan broke, like going out at night, were ways to protect himself from the wrath of the entity, which always circled in search of new victims. And now, with Ethan breaking the cycle and exposing himself to danger, he has become the next target. The Shadow marked him, as he had done with all those who dared to challenge the Covenant. Suddenly, the temperature drops sharply, and Ethan feels the air around him become heavy, almost suffocating. The Shadow appears in the central square, materializing from the shadows around. This time, it is larger, more oppressive, a mass of living, undulating darkness with a distorted and amorphous shape, but now incredibly tangible. Her presence is overwhelming, draining all hope and warmth from the environment. Ethan knows he can't beat an entity like this with physical strength, but there is something that he realizes. The shadow feeds on fear, submission. The city lives in terror, surrendering to its rule without resistance. Ethan decides that if there is a chance to defeat her, he must face her fearlessly, challenging the cycle that the founders created. He stands firm as the entity approaches, closer and closer to touching him with his invisible claws. The cold that emanates from it is almost unbearable, but Ethan does not give in. He shouts to the darkness, "I am not yours. I am not theirs." For a brief moment, the world around him seems to falter. The shadow stops as if puzzled. The shadows around the square tremble and seem to hesitate, as if the entity is losing some of its power. Ethan then makes a bold decision. He pulls a small knife from his pocket and cuts his hand, letting the blood drip on the ground. "If you want to sacrifice, take my blood. But I will not run away. I will not be afraid." Seeing the blood of Ethan, the shadow shakes, as if about to devour him. But unlike past sacrifices, he is not offered for others. Ethan is breaking the covenant by making his own choice. The entity seems confused, as if the cycle that kept it connected to the city was breaking. Then, something unexpected happens. The shadow retreats, its contours beginning to crumble. The shadows around the square seem to lose strength, dissipating like mist in the wind. Ethan's sacrifice is not accepted as the entity expected. He did not give in to fear, did not follow the cycle of submission of the city. The shadow begins to fade, disappearing back into the darkness from which it came. Silver Creek, for the first time in centuries, feels a release, as if the weight of a dark presence is rising. Ethan falls to his knees, exhausted, as the air around him begins to warm again. He did the impossible. He broke the cycle of terror that had imprisoned the city for generations. When the sun rises, Silver Creek looks different. The oppressive atmosphere that has always been there has dissipated, and the residents go out to the streets with expressions of surprise and relief. They know, instinctively, that the curse has been broken. Grace finds Ethan, still weak but alive, in the center of the square. She helps you to stand up, with a mixture of admiration and guilt in the eyes. "You did what no one had the courage to do," she says softly. "You broke the cycle." Ethan, still trying to process what happened, looks around. The city is now just a city, no longer a place of shadows and secrets. He, however, will never be the same. Although the shadow has disappeared, he feels that his presence marked him in some way. Something changed inside him. As he packs his things to leave Silver Creek, he realizes that the city has freed him, but also transformed him. He is a survivor of something incomprehensible, and the feeling that something dark still observes him from a distance will never completely abandon him. As he leaves the city, Ethan looks in the rearview mirror and sees Silver Creek disappear in the distance. But one question torments him. Was the shadow really defeated, or just backed away, waiting for a new opportunity? What Ethan knows is that, although he has escaped, the supernatural is a force that never really disappears. It just changes shape, waiting for the next unwary who dares to cross its path. And as he leaves the city, he sees his own shadow longer than it should be, as if something is always one step behind, lurking. The story begins with young journalist, Sarah, driving down a winding road that winds through an autumn landscape, with red and golden leaves falling gently from the trees. She is looking for inspiration and a new story for her column, and the town of Willow Creek, with its rustic charm and enigmatic legends, seems to be the perfect place. Upon arrival, she is greeted by an atmosphere of nostalgia, with old wooden houses and a central square where the residents gather, but soon realizes that there is a subtext of fear and discomfort between them. Sarah settles into a small inn where the owner, an elderly woman named Mabel, watches her with curious eyes. Mabel offers a hot tea and starts to share stories about the city. However, as soon as Sarah mentions the whispers and the cult, Mabel becomes visibly restless, quickly changing the subject and suggesting that Sarah avoid the forest at night. This reaction piqued the curiosity of Sarah, who decides to investigate further. In the following days, Sarah talks to local residents, visiting the convenience store and coffee shop of the city, where she hears rumors about unexplained disappearances that occurred every autumn. Some residents talk about shadowy figures seen moving between the trees, while others mumble about an echo of the past that still haunts the city. However, everyone seems reluctant to give details. The fear of reopening old wounds is palpable. Determined, Sarah decides to explore the forest that surrounds the city. One afternoon, at nightfall, she takes her lantern and ventures into the woods. The forest is dense and dark, with tall trees that seem to lean over it. As it deepens, the environment becomes quieter, except for the sound of your footsteps on the floor covered with leaves. A supernatural cold permeates the air, and Sarah feels a strange presence, as if she is being watched. As the darkness deepens, Sarah finds a clearing where there is a circle of stones. Distant whispers begin to echo around her, causing her heart to speed. She wonders if it's just the wind or something more sinister. As she raised the lantern, she noticed that the broken mirrors were arranged along the edges of the clearing, reflecting the light in a distorted way. The atmosphere becomes oppressive, and a sense of urgency makes her retreat, but not without first recording the scene in her notebook. Returning to the inn, Sarah cannot take the whispers out of her head. The villagers seem more tense when she mentions her exploration, and she realizes that she is entering dangerous territory. With curiosity bubbling inside her, Sarah decides she needs to find out what's really going on in Willow Creek, even if it means confronting the fears that the city hides beneath its quiet surface. The call to truth echoes in her mind, and she is determined to go forward no matter what. As the days pass in Willow Creek, Sarah delves into her research, determined to understand the mysteries surrounding the city. With her notebook always at hand, she begins to interview older residents who seem to have vivid memories but are reluctant to share. The wrinkled faces and trembling hands of the elders reveal the weight of untold secrets. Most of the residents speak in whispers, as if they feared that the walls of the city were listening. During a visit to the local library, Sarah comes across a collection of old newspapers, yellowed by time. As she leafs through the pages, she discovers reports about the cult that used to gather in Willow Creek. The stories tell about mysterious disappearances, night meetings, and strange practices surrounding the members of the sect. A name stands out: the Children of the Mist. It was a cult that, according to rumors, worshipped an entity known as the Shadow, a being who supposedly fed on fear and pain. The reports describe obscure rituals, where members gathered on full moon nights, surrounded by strange symbols carved into tree trunks. Sarah is intrigued by a photo of a group of people in front of the same clearing she found in the forest, their serious expressions and gloom contrasting with the innocence of the city. She notes that a woman in the picture looks very much like Mabel, the owner of the inn. This connection provokes a wave of curiosity and, at the same time, a certain fear. Sarah decides to confront Mabel about the sect and its memories. That night, when meeting with Mabel at the inn, Sarah asks the question she has been avoiding. Mabel, initially hesitant, begins to reveal fragments of her youth. She talks about the fear that surrounded the sect and how the villagers have moved away from the rituals. "There was something about the whispers that made us lose control," says Mabel, her eyes filled with sadness. "The rituals were not just beliefs, they were true and terrifying. Many people disappeared without a trace, and those who returned were never the same." As Mabel recounts her memories, Sarah feels a shiver running through her spine. The woman talks about a ritual in which people were supposedly chosen to be sacrificed, and the whispers were seen as a call from the entity. Mabel describes a fateful night in which she and other young people were drawn into the forest, where they saw the shadowy figures dancing in the moonlight. That night was forever marked in her memory, and since then, the fear of the forest has accompanied her. This revelation throws Sarah in a whirlwind of emotions. The history of the sect intertwines with the history of the city, and the connection to Mabel makes it more personal. Determined to find out more, Sarah begins searching for records of disappearances and old police investigations. By researching the city's archives, she finds lists of names of people who have mysteriously disappeared over the decades, many of whom are family members of residents still living in the city. One morning, while examining a dusty old diary in the library, Sarah discovers an account written by a former member of the cult that details not only the rituals but also a prophecy about the entity's return, scheduled to occur every 50 years. With the next full moon approaching, Sarah realizes that time is running out. The discoveries she makes about the city's past are not just stories of a lost time. They are intimately linked to what is happening now. Troubled but also excited by the truth that is being revealed, Sarah finds herself on the verge of a new reality. Echoes from the past are not just shadows, but urgent warnings. Determined to understand what lies behind the whispers, she prepares a plan to face the darkness that threatens Willow Creek. With the knowledge acquired about the sect and the mysteries surrounding Willow Creek, Sarah feels she can no longer ignore the forest. Every night, the whispers seem higher in your mind, calling it a hypnotic chant. She realizes that the truth she seeks is rooted in that dark place. Arming herself with her notebook, a flashlight, and the determination to face her fears, Sarah decides that she must go into the forest again, but this time, prepared. The night before the full moon, Sarah joins Mark, a friend she made while investigating. He has always been skeptical about legends, but the change in behavior of the locals and rumors about disappearances have left him uneasy. The idea of exploring the forest together gives both a sense of purpose and a hope to discover the truth behind the whispers. As they approach the forest entrance, the atmosphere changes. The air gets colder, and a thick mist begins to form, wrapping them in an uncomfortable embrace. As they walk down the trail, Sarah and Mark feel the pressure of the forest silence. Each branch snap under their feet seems to echo like a warning. The vegetation is dense, and the light of the lantern can barely penetrate the darkness, creating dancing shadows in the trees. As they deepen, Sarah begins to hear the whispers more clearly. They seem to talk to each other, alternating between incoherent words and phrases that intertwine, becoming a disturbing melody that makes your hair shudder. Finally, they reach the clearing that Sarah discovered earlier. The vision makes her feel a chill in her spine. In the center, a formation of stone seems almost magical under the light of the moon, reflecting a supernatural aura. Around the stones, Sarah notices marks on the ground, patterns that resemble the symbols described in the diary she read. The air is charged with a palpable energy, and the whispers intensify, as if the forest was waiting for them. As they examine the clearing, Sarah comes across an object left behind, a stone amulet covered with moss and leaves. Upon touching him, she has a sudden vision, images of a ritual, people dressed in dark robes, dancing around a campfire, while a shadowy figure watches from a distance. Terror invades her, and she finds herself unable to look away, as if the forest were revealing its past. Mark notices his change of expression and approaches, worried. As Sarah tries to explain what she saw, a strong breeze blows through the clearing, causing the trees to whisper more strongly. Suddenly, they hear distant laughter and steps that seem to approach. The fear settles, and the adrenaline makes their hearts shoot. They look at each other, quietly deciding that it is time to leave, but as they turn to leave the clearing, they see silhouettes moving among the trees, dark figures that seem to be approaching. Panic sets in when Sarah and Mark start running along the trail, trying not to get lost in the darkness. The whispers are now incoherent screams, a chorus of voices that seem to call their names. The feeling of being chased drives them to run even faster, but the forest seems to change around them, with the trees leaning over as if they wanted to prevent them from escaping. Finally, they emerge from the forest, panicked and frightened, but not without the marks of experience. Fear is etched on their faces, and the reality of what they have faced becomes clearer. Returning to the inn, Sarah and Mark talk about what they saw and heard. The connection between the sect and the voices that haunt them becomes undeniable. What they experienced united them in an unbreakable way, but also made them aware that the forces at Willow Creek are closer than they thought. As the full moon shines over the city, the pressure of time intensifies. They must find out how to stop the whispers and face the entity that hides in the shadows before the disappearances begin again. With this, Sarah knows that the truth is closer than ever, but she also feels that the danger around her is about to reveal itself in an even more terrifying way. On the night of the full moon, Willow Creek is shrouded in a disturbing silence. Sarah and Mark meet at the inn, determined to disrupt the cult's rituals and confront the entity they feared so much. They revisit Sarah's notes, including the diary of the former cult member, for clues on how to defend themselves from the shadow. The diary mentions an ancient invocation that could repel the entity, but also warns that the shadow feeds on fear and pain. With the weight of truth on their shoulders, they head back into the forest, armed with courage and the invocation that they hope will work. As soon as they enter the forest, the weather changes instantly. The air is heavy and charged with a negative energy. The whispers that were once distant now seem to become a distressing cry, filling the darkness around them. Sarah feels fear to settle, but the determination to face the shadow drives her forward. Mark stands by his side, the gaze steady, although his eyes reveal the panic he tries to control. Arriving at the clearing, they find the circle of stones already prepared, illuminated by the light of the full moon. In the center, the shadows writhe, and the presence of the shadow becomes palpable, an amorphous form that rises from the ground, making the surrounding vegetation wither and twist. The figure looks almost human, but its features are distorted and grotesque, reflecting Sarah's deepest fears. The shadow rises, whispering the darkest secrets of your life, revealing your regrets, failures, and traumas. Sarah feels the pressure of every word penetrating her mind, but remembers the invocation she read in the diary. With a trembling voice, she begins to recite the words, the emotion growing inside her. As the words come out, the clearing seems to vibrate, and the shadow hesitates, its contorted forms trembling. Mark, realizing that Sarah needs support, also joins her in reciting. Their voices intertwine, creating a harmony that defies the whispers that try to destabilize them. The shadow, now agitated, seems to lose its shape, eyes staring at them as it shakes, sending a wave of terror that makes Sarah's heart explode. As the invocation progresses, the shadow rides, trying to approach them. Sarah and Mark must fight against the growing wave of fear. Sarah remembers her grandmother, the lessons she learned about courage and love. With that in mind, she modifies the invocation into a statement of strength and hope. "We are not slaves of the past," shouts her voice echoing across the clearing. "We are not defined by our fears." Sarah's words seem to strike the shadow, and the entity emits a high-pitched scream that resonates through the forest. With each syllable they pronounce, they feel the pressure dissipate, and the shadow begins to fragment, its distorted forms losing consistency. The ground beneath them trembles, and the whispers turn into cries of despair as the shadow is forced to retreat. Finally, with a powerful last cry of courage, Sarah finishes the invocation, and the shadow explodes in a storm of shadows that disperse, being absorbed by the moonlight. The clearing is illuminated, and the oppressive pressure disappears, giving way to a sense of relief and liberation. Tired but victorious, Sarah and Mark embrace each other, realizing they have been able to face what many feared. The forest now seems quieter, and the whispers that were once a source of terror turn into a gentle whisper of the wind, as if nature is thanking. When you return to Willow Creek, the city looks different. The fear that once hovered over people has begun to dissipate, and Sarah feels that despite the scars left by the past, the community can begin to heal. With the story they lived, she feels ready to tell the truth about the cult and the shadow, helping the city confront its past and move on. The story ends with Sarah writing in her notebook, a new light of hope illuminating her mind. The fight against shadows may be terrifying, but courage and truth have the power to set you free. Willow Creek can finally find peace, and Sarah, with her new understanding, is ready to share her story with the world.